Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So let's us begin our session today with the recitation of the Kitab al-Fatiha. Okay, thank you for coming to this session. Actually, this session is part of the talk on Malaysian economy, and this is also organized by the IIUM Center for Islamic Economics. And the topic that we will discuss today is on Islam and economic development in Malaysia. And we have with us today Professor Muhammad Aslam Muhammad Haneef. I don't think I need to introduce him to all of us. His contribution in the discipline of Islamic economics, as well as in the area of Islamic economics education, are too numerous to mention. So I can even say that his achievements and contributions in these areas are not less to some of those people who have won the IDB prize winner, and hopefully he can also have that award in the near future, inshallah. He has also been very loyal and dedicated to IIUM, being the first part of the first batch of IIUM in 1983. After that, he served the university until almost his retirement age. Almost coming soon, yeah. And I hope he will contribute continuously to the kuliah and also to the university, especially in the area of Islamic economics. I cannot imagine what we will do at the kuliah without his guidance and contribution, inshallah. So today, without further ado, I would like to invite Prof. Aslam to give a talk on Islam and economic development in Malaysia for maybe 1 hour, around 1 hour, and then we will open for question and answer session. And for those who are taking Malaysian economy, this is part of the final exam. So pay attention, take notes, and hopefully you can also participate later, asking questions or even giving comments. Yeah. So I invite Prof. Aslam.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Dr. Nizam, for the introduction. I think as mentioned, I have spent quite a lot of time in the university, and I have to tell you, I still don't like the arrangement in this hall. It's very awkward when you're giving a lecture. You have the camera pointed here, but then you have students here and students there, so it's going to be a little bit difficult to get everybody. So I usually like to walk around, but it would not be possible today. So I'm going to be standing here and going through some of the slides that I have. Now, Dr. Nizam is here, so I'm going to do a test on him. What have you studied so far in this course in Malaysian economy? What have you done?
Before they answer, I need to put a disclaimer. Because we lost how many Mondays?
Oh, right. Okay.
At least 3 weeks were gone.
But I'm sure it's just a
So
just tell me whatever it is that you remember from what you've done in the class. Yeah.
Basically, what I remember, we studied on the structural transformation, basically from the economic policy until the recent one, the shared prosperity vision.
Okay.
And then also we learn about some sectors, the main sectors, the manufacturing, the services, and also the primary sector, agro, agriculture. And also we learn some policies on each of the sectors, the NAP 1, NAP 2, NAP 3, also the look through how Malaysia progressed over the years from
Okay.
1970s after the independence until the new.
Okay, so your name?
Adam.
Adam, okay, this is a good example. It's covered everything that I wanted to hear. Basically,
You can claim 3 marks bonus after this.
okay. So basically, the first part of the course would have talked about that structural transformation, right? How Malaysia in the last 65 years, if you take 57, how we have moved from being an agriculture and mineral-based economy to, well, we are still an agriculture and mineral-based economy, just that the agriculture has changed and the mineral has changed, but we've also diversified, right? So we've got a very thriving manufacturing sector, and of course now services are the engine of the country, right? So we've made that structural transformation, and for probably 20 years, from late 1980s, not 20, even 15 years, from the late 80s right up to the end of the 90s, Malaysian growth and economic performance was considered to be exceptionally good, right? If you look at the average growth rate, it would have been about 7 point something percent per year. That's not easy to achieve, right? Of course, after the financial crisis of 98, we've not reached those levels, right? So meaning to say, we're not growing as fast as we want, and especially because we also have, as part of our development goal, the goal of equity, which means a kind of redistribution of wealth, okay? And you cannot talk about redistribution without a growing economy. If you try to redistribute when the economy is not growing, then you are taking away from people and giving to other people. So there's going to be people who are not happy. So the only way you can actually have equity goal is when the pie or the economy is growing. So we've been trying to grow, and that's why it's so important for us to have growth, right? So we went through this structural transformation, and we've had some hiccups. Okay, we are trying to get back on track, but it has not been easy, especially in the last 2 or 3 years. You know, with the pandemic, we were hit very badly. So if you remember, if you have your graphs, you know, that you have seen of the Malaysian economy, you know, 98, there was a big dip, the worst ever. And then in 2021, right? Yeah, 2020, we had another big dip, right? Not as big as the 98, but still that was the second largest recession. And we've only just come back maybe to pre-COVID levels. So we are back on track. Now, I'm sure you've done this, or at least you've been introduced to the first 7, I'm quite sure, the 5-year plans, right? So we have long-term plans like the new economic policy, as you mentioned, national development policy, etc. Then you got education policy, culture policy. Probably we don't do as much in Malaysian economy class, but it's a very important policy in Malaysia as well. I think going to become important again. We have the national agriculture policy. We have something called Malaysia Incorporated. I don't know whether you heard of this. Malaysia Incorporated? No? Yes? Basically, this was something that was brought in the 1980s, as with actually many of those, the agriculture policy, all in the 1980s. Although we actually, Malaysia was 1963, right? And Malaya Federation getting independence in 57. Privatization policy in the 80s as well. Industrialization master plan, the first one also came out in the 80s. So a lot of our policy and planning documents were actually coming out in the 80s. Although we were doing things, of course, previously as well, right? Now, 8 to 12, I'm not sure whether you're quite used to it. Maybe you heard it, but it wasn't discussed because they're not really things that are discussed in economy class. The Look East policy, okay? You may have heard of it because, yes, we look at Japan, we look at Korea. But what many people don't realize is there is an economic dimension to that policy. We do trade, more trade with Japan and Korea. We get investment from Japan and Korea. And then in more recent times, China, right? So that's the economics part. I think we can appreciate it. But there was also another important component of that Look East policy, and that was to emulate the value and work culture of the Japanese and maybe lesser the Koreans. Yeah, so the Japanese work culture was something that we wanted to adopt. So Look East policy was not only about economics, it had that value dimension, right? And then there was this inculcation of Islamic values policy. In Malay, we will say penerapan nilai-nilai Islam. Also in the 1980s, right? Leadership by example. Clean, efficient, and trustworthy government. Yeah, these are all the policies that were brought in, especially in the 1980s. And later on, we will try to explain to you why we look at the 1980s when we are doing this analysis of the topic Islam and economic development, right? And there's a population plan and so on. So there are many government economic policies and related policies that we have been being introduced in the country since right from independence, but certainly since the 1970s with the new economic policy, and then in 1980s so many policies, right? Now, I want to focus on the 80s, as I mentioned, and I'm looking at this midterm review of the 4th Malaysia Plan. I hope all of you, now everything is on, on the website. You can go to Economic Planning Unit and go to their website and look at all the Malaysia plans. Previously, we used to have to get the physical copy, so it was like 3 to 4 inches thick, right? And it was always blue in color. It would be a dark blue, and every Malaysia plan will almost be the same as the previous plan in terms of chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Only the numbers will change, right? But now all of you will get this on, online. I'm looking at the midterm review of the 4th Malaysia Plan. It came out in 1983. So the 5-year plans, 81 to 85, 86 to 1990, right? So this is the 5-year plans. Midterm, they do a review. What we have achieved, what we have not achieved, right? So the midterm review is a very important document, at least for this course. And there was a realization, and I put in as a question mark because I'm not sure whether it was really a realization or it was something that followed the global trends of the late 70s and 80s. But there was a realization that culture matters, especially work culture, right? Malaysia resource rich, alhamdulillah. We have been blessed with tin and rubber and then oil, palm oil. Yeah, so we've got resources, but you can have all the resources in the world, but if you don't have the right work culture, and if you don't have the right planning and human resource, you're not necessarily going to have success, right? So based on some of the documents that came out in the 1980s, there seemed to be a realization that culture matters. Especially in the case of Malaysia, where you have about 60% Muslims, all right? And these 60% are also economically left behind. Okay, so you got a situation where the majority population in Malaysia economically is behind others. Now, when I say others, I'm not referring necessarily to the Malaysian Chinese or the Indians. I'm talking about the foreigners. The Malaysian economy was dominated by foreign control. Even in 1969, it was the foreigners that had the big chunk of the economy. Out of all the, what you may say, the local citizens, the Malays were left behind. And so you needed to have economic plan that could get these 60% to change their mindset, their value system, and their work culture. All right, so you will see why this is so important later on. So in other words, the human factor, the realization that the human factor is central to development efforts. Hence, since the 1980s, you find document after document will talk about human resource development, the need to have human capital, etc., all the terminology used, right? Now, it's not as if we didn't talk about human resource. If you go back to 1960s, you will see that there was already a national education policy in place. But in the 1960s, the focus was on just building primary schools, building secondary schools, right? So you basic schooling for all children. So that was in the 60s, right? And then slowly, as you went to the 70s, 80s, higher education became important. So you needed to give opportunities for people to have higher education opportunities, right? So now we have, was it 20 universities in Malaysia? We have 20 public universities and so many private universities, right? So that has been, to a certain extent, provision of education opportunities is there. Of course, whether it's quality education, this is another issue. We need to always improve that. But education has always been important in Malaysia. But what we are talking about when we say human resource development, we are referring to, at least as in economics, we are talking about the workforce, the quality of the workforce. All right. And I think all of you are following the debates. Everybody's complaining about the quality of our education system, and graduates are not what the industry wants, etc. So there's a big debate, not only in Malaysia, it's also, in many other countries as well. So while education is important, we want to focus more on how education is connected to developing that human resource, that will enable us to get back on track. We need to move up the value chain, right? Away from low cost, low skill labor. We talk about high value add and high income, etc., etc. Okay, so human resource, very, very important. I'm going to just ask you all, usually I hope Dr. Nizam will do it. It's a very good way of making sure all of you keep up to date. Because when you use a book or any article, these dates, the data is outdated. Right? You will get something 15 years ago or 10 years ago. So I will always get all of you, please get the latest figures, right? So for example, if we say that now there are bigger number of higher institutions, how many students are studying and all, you can go and find it, right? Probably 400,000 or something like that in public universities, another 400,000 in private universities, that we have now. And if you compare that with 1970s, huge increase, right? Similarly, private higher education has become very important, but it's not new. It's not that old. It's only 25 years old. Mid-1990s that you started having a lot of private universities being established. And of course, since the mid-90s, the discussion has been on information society, knowledge-based society, and the use of ICT in everything, right? So much so that now they are talking about AI-related economies, and I think in Malaysia now they're going to talk about something called DNA 23. Digital, DNA is not DNA as in, but it's digital, nobody, I forget. So it's not a very popular policy yet, but probably will be coming. DNA 23, I think this is what they call this. All right, now in that midterm review in 1983, they talked about value policies. The government wanted to emphasize on certain value policies to change the work culture in the country. All right. in addition to looking at the work culture, there was also a shift away from Europe, especially Britain, to Japan, especially Japan. All right. This period in 1981 coincides with the first term of Dr. Mahathir as Prime Minister, and he was very much a supporter of looking east. In fact, he was the one that basically, asked for the change in that direction towards Japan, and then later on Korea. So part of these value policies I mentioned just now, look east policy, it had a direct economic focus, but it also had this value dimension, emulating the work culture of the Japanese. So it was very common in the 1980s, late 1980s. Many Malaysian companies, even government departments, will start their Monday morning with exercise, like they used to do they do in Japan until now. Yeah, so a lot of following the Japanese work culture. Now, in addition to the look east policy, which was a big policy, we wanted to emulate Japanese work culture in everything we did. We wanted to increase trade and investment with Japan, etc. There was another policy which didn't get as much attention, and that is called the inculcation of Islamic values policy. All right. Look east policy, it has a value dimension. Let's follow the Japanese because they have very good work ethics. One example, if the boss comes in the morning, he has to be the first one in. And nobody will leave the office until the boss leaves in the evening, right? So usually the boss will go very late. So that kind of work culture, as an example. That was for the nation, for the private sector as a whole. Emulate Japanese. And of course, in the late 60s and 70s, Japanese were the country to emulate, right? The way they developed their economy after World War II, right? From being totally with the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they built themselves up to be an economic powerhouse by the 60s. In 20 years, they were able to do that in one generation, all right? So they were a country that Malaysia wanted to emulate. But this inculcation of Islamic values policy, this is something that had a more limited focus, right? Do I have it in the next? We need to first ask the question, is it even relevant to talk about religion and economics together? Because for many people, including many economists, they would say that there is no connection between culture and economics, or even religion, more so religion and economics, right? Because religion is religion and economics is economics. There's no connection between the two. So now we are trying to say that there is a connection. Okay, so is it even relevant to do that? Anyone has a view? Is it relevant? Yes, no? It is? Okay. Now, of course, it's easy to say yes, but give me a reason. Whatever answer you give, I can almost guarantee the sun will still remain outside the window. Don't worry. Yeah. There will be no earthquake. Yeah. Whatever answer you say. Why? Why do you think that religion is relevant for economics? Yes.
Yeah, actually, religion is the backbone and ideology behind it. Because mostly, I have listened to your lecture before. You say economics is fundamentally ideology. And in that sense, in Islamic framework, it gives the moral ethics for the person to ethically do policies as well as effectively do all things.
Economics basically deals with human behavior, right? It's how people consume, how we make decisions on production, right? How we decide what is a fair distribution in the society and so on. So it's talking about human behavior. And human beings have values, right? So those values come from various sources. And certainly for Muslims, religion would be a very important source of those values. So that's why we say that culture matters, religion matters, right? Because it shapes our worldview and our value system. What we consider to be right or wrong, good or bad, this is shaped a lot by our value system. And therefore, since religion plays an important part of at least our society in Malaysia or in Muslim countries, it is very relevant for our economics, right? So in the writing that is available in scholarly literature, you have to try and make a basis for it, a justification why you say so. And this is actually coming from a critique of what is called the modernization thesis. All right. Now, in the 60s, after World War II, in the 50s and 60s, you had the countries of the West with the establishment of the World Bank and IMF after World War II. The world was divided into the first world, the second world, and the third world. The first world was basically the market economies of Europe and America and Northern America. And then you had the second world, the communist bloc, the Soviet Union. And then you had a lot of these developing countries we were put as the third world. Okay. And many of these developing countries, including Malaysia, we got independence in 57 or 63, we became Malaysia. And one of the important agenda for all these developing countries was to get developed. All right. And a very important, you could say, process that was being promoted by these World Bank and IMF and these international agencies was telling the developing countries how you can become developed or how you can modernize. Okay, so you get advisors coming from World Bank and IMF attached to developing countries, advising their central bank and their leaders on how to become modernized or how modernization can take place in your country. All right. So Daniel Lerner wrote this article in the International Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, and he explains what modernization is. It's a process in which less developed countries acquired the characteristics of developed countries. It makes very simple sense, right? If you are not developed, you follow the ones that are developed. Okay. Now, one of the characteristics, please read the article. It gives a more detailed picture of what modernization means. But one of the characteristics of being modern, all right, or to go through this modernization process is the diffusion of secular norms. Now, what it means is that as you want to become developed, as you want to follow the West, Europe, America, one of the things that they went through is they have become more and more secular societies through that process of secularization. That's why I put a slash modernization, secularization thesis. All right. But modernization is more than just secularization. It's just that for this particular argument, we're talking about religion and economic development. The modernization thesis is saying, in order to modernize, you should also secularize. And since we are emulating countries in the West, it's also a westernization process because all the developed countries are in the West, right? So this is what Daniel Lerner wrote. Another scholar who wrote about development in Southeast Asia, Frederick von der Mehden, in some then modernization literature, particularly in the 50s and 60s, pictured a decline in religious values, attitudes, and practices, and legitimacy as modernization proceeded in its inevitable forward progress. So modernization is a positive process. Okay, it's development. It's moving from something not so good to something better. With this modernization would come the weakening of traditional, irrational, unscientific or pre-scientific attitudes and behavior, and the acceptance of modern foundations of reasoning. Now, I hope in your other classes you will be clear about what the modern foundations of reasoning means, that you reason with no connection to revelation. That's what it means. Human reason is sufficient for you to make whatever decision. So this is what would happen in a society. If you want to modernize, you need to give up this irrational and traditional way of life and just depend on your reason, your observation, science. So science will replace religion as the authority when you want to decide on whatever policy and economic development that you want. Okay, so this is the modernization thesis. And that was prevalent even in Malaysia. So our initial government of the day in 1957 would have continued with the British system, right? And that is clear. You can read up and look at the policies. We continued with many British institutions and laws and system because that's the system that we knew, all right? Now, this idea of religion playing a role is counter to this modernization thesis. So the basis of our argument that religion plays a role is a counter to this modernization thesis. So did the Muslim world challenge this modernization thesis? Right? So we talk about the 1950s and 60s. If any of you are fans of P. Ramlee movies, and if you watched some of his movies that showed life in Kuala Lumpur or Singapore in the 1960s, you see a very modern, it's a very liberal society, especially urban areas, right? Keluarga 69, yeah. There are some of his movies that focus on urban life in Malaya and in Singapore. Very, very modern, liberal, even westernized. Okay, that was the situation in the 50s and 60s. But in the Muslim world, slowly, by the 70s, mid-70s, there was a kind of, not a rejection, but people wanted development, they wanted progress, but they also want their religion. So in the Muslim world, we wanted modernization, but we did not want to embrace the secularization process. And this happened in the 70s. Certain events were very, very huge events. I'm sure, well, none of you were born at that time. You had, for example, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, a very big event that had impact in Malaysia. The Iranian Revolution, in which the Shah was replaced by, you know, the Ayatollah Khomeini. These two events in the 70s were big events. It basically gave a kind of confidence booster to Muslims that they could defeat bigger powers. Of course, in the case of Afghanistan, it took many years after that to defeat, and so on. But this had impact on the Muslim world. All right. And if you think about it, it makes sense. You know, anytime Muslims are in charge of their own country, there will be calls for you to go back to your own history, because Muslims had a 1,000+ year history of leading the world, right? Muslim civilization were leaders in the world for at least 1,000 years, right? If you think about the current Western civilization, 300 years, 400 years. So when you talk about history of civilizations, you know, Muslim civilization relatively long long history of success, right? So people will want to go back to the great examples of our past, right? So slowly people want to also revive back the religion. So we wanted to have development, progress, but also our religion. Now, come to our question. Was there a role that Islam played in the development of Malaysia? Okay. Rodney Wilson, who was a professor in the university that Dr. Nizam did his PhD in Durham University. He has been with us in Islamic economics right from the beginning, yeah, although he's a non-Muslim. He wrote this article in 1998 entitled Islam and Economic Development in Malaysia, right? And he put forward 3 questions. First, is there a model of, is there an Islamic model of development? Secondly, have the political leadership in Malaysia applied it? And 3, has Islam significantly contributed to Malaysia's economic development? 3 questions, all right? Now, the first 2 questions, he said yes. Why? Because there are many writings, which I hope all of you have been exposed to, because you're all in your 3rd or 4th year now in the program. Yeah. So since the 1960s and 70s and 80s, there have been a lot of writings on Islamic economics. And many of them actually talk about development, right? So because they have all these writings, there is an Islamic view of development. Khurshid Ahmad talked about development, many articles. We even have an Islamic Development Bank, and now an Islamic Development Bank Institute, formerly known as IRTI. All right. So definitely we do have views and models of development from an Islamic perspective. Have the political leadership in Malaysia applied it? Yes. And he says why? There have been some Islamic reforms in Malaysia. So there are policies that Malaysian authorities developed and implemented. So the first 2 questions, he says yes. Now, to the 3rd question, did Islamic reforms have a significant contribution to Malaysian economic development? He said no. All right. And the reason he said no is because he looked at Islamic banking, and in 1998 or in 1997, the total assets of Islamic banking were 2%. So he said, you have been having these reforms since 1980s. After 15 years, it's only 2%. So I don't think Islamic reforms has contributed a lot to Malaysian economic development. So when I saw his answer, I thought it was a little bit, maybe the justification was not right. Anyone has an idea why I think the justification is not right? He answered no, and then he said only 2% Islamic bank. Why is that not a necessarily good answer or good evidence? Anyone?
Maybe because he only focused on one sector. For example, in Malaysia, there's also like halal sector that I think contributes a lot in Malaysia.
Sorry, your name?
Shahmi.
Shahmi. You are right, except that in 1980s or 90s, there was no halal industry. This is something much later, but there were some activities. But you are right. How can you claim that Islam does not impact economic development and you only look at banking asset, 2%? Okay. Now, if you use that example, today, anybody can tell me what's the Islamic banking and finance assets as a percentage of total assets in Malaysia? Anyone? It's more than 25%, maybe close to 30% today, maybe. Yeah. Now, if Rodney Wilson was writing this today and he saw 30%, maybe he will say, yes, Islam has contributed to Malaysian economic development. So using just that banking asset, you cannot make the conclusion. So this is why I decided to look into this a little bit more. So what did I do? Now again, when we want to look at Malaysian example, you need to have some kind of conceptual or theoretical base. And so what I thinking about what happened in Malaysia, I came up with this formula, factors needed for successful Islamic reforms in any country. So it's not only for Malaysia. You need political will. By political will, I don't mean that the government or the president or the prime minister must want it. Political will can also be in a non-Muslim country. Muslim society can get together and decide they want to do something. That's political will. In other words, they may want to have Islam playing a bigger role. That's political will. But in the case of Malaysia, yes, it was the government. So political will is the first P. The second P is the people. When we say people, we mean the leaders, the implementers, as well as general public. So the people, all right? And the third is policies. What policies that you introduce, whether they are policies that are effective or not, all right? And then supporting environment. It's not only economics. You need a supporting environment in order for you to have successful reforms. Now, I believe these three Ps and three Ps and S can also be applied to any policy you want to have. You want to have good industrial policy, you need the political will, right? In Malaysia, we wanted to have a car, so we pushed the Proton project, right? And then you need people, the engineers and the people who are going to be involved in that. And you need the policies. What kind of policy did you have in order to promote the Proton project? And then you need the supporting environment as well. So you can use this for actually all cases, but I'm using this in the case of Islamic reforms. So were these factors present in Malaysia? That's the question. Political will, people, policies, supporting environment. Okay, so let's look at it. Oh, okay, it's right on top. Islam and economic development in Malaysia. When do we start? Do we choose 1957 when Federation of Malaya got independence? Do we choose 1963 when Malaysia was formed? When do we start? Now, I'm starting in the 1980s because it was only in the 1980s that the government of Malaysia publicly announced that they want to make Islam part of their development policy. Before 1980, the previous administrations did not talk about Islam playing a role in economic development. Okay, remember I told you that in the 50s and 60s, the secularization process, the modernization process was actually going on, not only in Malaysia, but all over the Muslim world. All right? If you speak to your, I'm trying to figure out, grandparents or great-grandparents, they will tell you that the 1950s and 60s, the consciousness of religion was less than today. Yeah? Today, probably the Islamic consciousness is more than your grandparents' time. Okay? And the reason is because that modernization process was going along. It was only in the 70s that Islamic consciousness started to come back again. And in the 1980s, the government of Malaysia decided to talk about Islam as a national policy in the country. All right? So a lot of things happened in the 70s. I'll leave you to read it. You had an external global resurgence happening all over the world. And internally in Malaysia, we had people wanting Islam. In the case of Malaysia, the youth was very, very active in this. All right, it wasn't necessarily a rural phenomena. It was actually an urban phenomena in the case of Malaysia. All right, so we are taking the 1980s as the starting point, because previous administrations did not talk about Islamic reforms to become a national agenda. And secondly, Islam was ceremonial, ritual. Okay, you only talk about Islam. Maybe in Ramadan, you will have Musabakah Al-Quran. Yeah? Now we don't have Musabakah in Ramadan, yeah? Because people now think that having Musabakah in Ramadan means that you miss your Tarawih. Because they used to have the program in Stadium Merdeka or Stadium Negara, and people will skip their Tarawih and go for the Musabakah. Yeah? So now Musabakah is held before Ramadan. Yeah. Oh, what's happening? Okay, I'm going to go a bit faster. Political will. Did we have political will? When Dr. Mahathir became Prime Minister, there was a document that the government published, Inculcation of Islamic Values Policy. In that policy, in that document, Islam will be a positive ingredient in the development of the nation and its people. So it wasn't even talking about Muslims. Islam will be a positive ingredient in the development of the nation and its peoples, in plural, for everybody. Okay? And this certainly is going against the modernization thesis. So you now want to make Islam part of your policy and not to secularize. Why did the federal government do this? Well, one is you are now governing your country. You go back to your tradition and heritage. This is quite natural. There was an external global Islamic resurgence happening. Internally, people were wanting Islam. And in the case of Malaysia, I will add one more factor. Dr. Mahathir wrote a book in 1970 called The Malay Dilemma. Okay, Malay Dilemma. 1970, so it was not 1980, 1970. And in that book, he has a chapter in which he talks about the role of Islam in developing Malays. Because the Malays were behind in the economy, in industry, etc. And so Dr. Mahathir wrote in 1970, one of the reasons why the Malays are backward, because they have a wrong understanding of their religion. So if you want to motivate the Malays, Islam can be a positive factor. So he wrote that in 1970. So I'm assuming when he becomes Prime Minister in 1982, okay, I want to bring my ideas into policy, right? So this was another reason in the case of Malaysia. But globally, there was an Islamic resurgence. And in Malaysia, you wanted, to make sure that you are following the times. Why? It's missing on top. There's also political opposition. Yeah, the Islamic Party at that time in 1980 changed their leaders, and the leader of the Islamic Party, Yusuf Rawa, was an Islamist, if I can use that term. Yeah, he wanted Islam to play a bigger role in society. And if you read your history of Malaysia, you will know that in the 1980s, we had a major problem in the country where this problem of takfir was quite major, especially from something called the Haji Hadi Fatwa, yeah, in which UMNO was branded to be kafir, yeah? And this created a lot of problems in the country. So there was pressure from opposition party for the government to also adopt Islam. So combined with Dr. Mahathir's own views in Malay dilemma, the government decided to adopt an Islamic reform package in the country. It's okay. All right. Now, what did the government do? On top, you have the slide, so you read yourself. In 1981, at that time, Dr. Mahathir was just acting prime minister. He wasn't prime minister yet. They set up Islamic Consultative Board. Yeah. Now look at the objective of this ICB. Yeah. No development policies and plans ran against Islamic values. So in other words, the claim was this board will look at everything you want to do in the country and make sure that there is nothing un-Islamic in the policy. Yeah, it's a very, very big claim, yeah, to say that you want to do this. All right. Now, who was chairing it? Because you can set up a committee and the chairman could be the head of Department of Economics, IIUM, right? But this committee was the Deputy Prime Minister at that time. He was the chairman of that committee. So it is not a small, low-level committee. It's a very high-level committee. Now, Rodney Wilson did not talk about this Islamic Consultative Board. He only looked at banking assets. But this board is a very important board. It shows that the government was serious about putting Islamic reforms. Now, whether they do it, this is another issue. You can look at what they did, etc. But the fact that they are announcing they are doing it, yeah, this is a major issue. Did it play a big role? In my own study, it did, especially in the first 5-6 years. It played a big role. After that, the ICB kind of just died off by itself, not because the government was not interested in talking about Islamic reforms, but because they decided to decentralize. Okay, for example, this university went through the ICB. Bank Islam went through the ICB. But once you got many universities now talking about Islamic agenda and curriculum, you cannot go to ICB all the time. So what will you do? You will send it to the Ministry of Education. You want to talk about Islamic Bank. When there was one bank, okay, ICB can talk about it. But once you want to talk about banking system, what do? Where will you put this Islamic banking reform? Who will do it? Who should do Islamic banking reforms? If you're talking about the entire system in Malaysia, Bank Negara Malaysia, right? So they set up first a unit in Bank Negara Malaysia. Now it's a whole department to look into Islamic banking and takaful. So similarly for other things, you decentralized it, no longer one board. So it did play a role, and this is not discussed by many people, right? Now, people, at that point in time, UMNO as a political party was known to be a more Malay nationalist party. Islamic credentials were not really there. The Islamic party was the party with Islamic credentials. Okay, so what did the government do? It looked at who they could bring into the government. And at that time, there were three possibilities. You have ABIM, the Muslim Youth Movement of Malaysia. The leader was Anwar Ibrahim. You have Darul Arkam. Yeah, the leader was Ash'ari Muhammad. They used to have a community in Sungai Penchala, yeah, near our old campus in PJ. All right, but there was a community kind of arrangement. Yeah, and then you had Jamatul Tabligh. They're still around. Now, looking at these three groups, the government decided, okay, let's talk to Anwar Ibrahim. So in 1982, they managed to co-opt Anwar Ibrahim into the government. And I suppose I can say now, after 40 years, he's now the prime minister, after a long going around in circles. So he is basically the one who came into the government in 1982. And the Islamic reform agenda was basically run by him and co-option of ABIM into the government machinery. right? Important success. So I call this an important success because you were able to co-opt Anwar Ibrahim into the federal government. So now the government was promoting Islamic reform. It's not coming from outside. It's not coming from NGO. It's not coming from, just individuals. Government agenda. Okay. Now, what did they do? This is the policy, the third component. So you have political will. You had the people. What about the policy? So inculcation of Islamic values. Look at the objective. This is taken from the document. Yeah, it's taken directly from the official document. The inculcation of Islamic values is aimed as government employees. Remember, Look East policy was for the country, for the private sector. Inculcation of Islamic values was aimed at government employees. And why is that? Why government employees? Why? That's an example, but why Islamic policy for government employees? Anti-corruption? I wish that was true, because the corruption actually went up after years. Because 90% of the government employees were Muslims. Okay, in 1980s, in fact, until today, the government employees are basically Muslims. So if you want to change their work culture, their attitudes, Islam can actually be an important motivator. Look at the values that they want to instill. In fact, they're even saying it, to enable the country to have an effective, strong, just, and progressive administration that would help create a dynamic work ethic to increase productivity. Okay, none of you have example, of course, of experienced it, but previously, if you want to get your national identity card, you have to line up 3 hours, put in the application, wait for another 1 week. Now you go, you can get it immediately, right? Don't talk about passports, even worse, right? You have to line up and it will take 1 month to get your passport. What are the values they want to instill? Amanah, responsibility, sincerity, etc., etc. So I look at the inculcation of Islamic values policy as a complement to the Look East policy. All right? You want to create a new work ethic in Malaysia, whether it is public sector or private sector. Yeah? It's very much economic policy. And that is why some writers, when they write about Malaysia, Islam in Malaysia, they call Malaysia the corporate Islam model. Because the policy that we put forward, a lot of it had to do with economics and business. Okay? They established a lot of Islamic institutions. Bank Islam, IIUM, YAPIM, the Islamic Economic Foundation, was reactivated in 84. Takaful in 85. Baitul Mal and Zakat collection was restructured. Now we have relatively good collection and distribution of Zakat compared to the 1980s. Believe me, I can vouch for it because things have improved a lot. They set up Islamic finance companies, interest-free counters in conventional banks, Labuan Offshore Financial Center, Islamic debt market, etc., etc. By the late 1990s, 15 years, we had a functioning dual financial system, Islamic and conventional. Okay, so Malaysia is considered to be the leader in this dual system. There are some criticisms, of course, but anyway, this is what we did. Yeah. It's telling me that we have to stop. Now, the last one before I will jump, legal provisions. Now, I said supporting environment. You want to have Islamic economic reforms, you cannot have those Islamic economic reforms if you just talk about economic reforms. You cannot just establish a bank. In order to establish the bank, you need legal provision to set up Islamic Bank. So they had to have Islamic Banking Act passed in Parliament. Okay. Now in Parliament, not everybody are Muslims. But yet we were able to get the Islamic Banking Act passed in Parliament. So non-Muslims also supported the setting up of Islamic Bank, the setting up of IIUM. Why? Because it was done not in the sensitive areas. You're not talking about hudud. You're not talking about, family law, and you want to stop non-Muslims from doing this or that. You're having a bank. You're having a university, right? So it's less controversial. So if there is another success story in Malaysia, it is how we were able to promote Islam in a way that even non-Muslims supported. So having the right policies are very important, right? We did not go down the path of many other countries where they talk about Islamic State, they talk about the Khalifah, they talk about hudud law. Here in Malaysia, we did it this way, and we got the support of everyone. Okay, so now we ask the question. Has Islam played a significant role in Malaysian economic development? Rodney Wilson said no, but he looked at banking assets, right? Now, what would our answer be? Would you say yes? How many of you, after listening to the presentation, will say yes? Put up your hand. How many say no? Nobody says no. So everyone says yes, or they're not sure. Okay. Now, when I look at all of these things that have been done, you have to say that a lot has been done. But is it really based on Islamic discourse? We set up a bank and then many banks, but the system is still being criticized heavily, right? There's a lot of criticism on Islamic banking. And that is why now in Malaysia, Central Bank for the last 5 years, they put forward a new plan for Islamic banking. They call it value-based intermediation. They want Islamic banks to go beyond profit, because all this while in the 80s, 90s, 2000, Islamic Bank was working on the profit model of banks. Their role was to maximize shareholders' wealth. But there's been a lot of criticisms on this model, and now Bank Negara has said we want to go beyond profit. We want to look at social impact. So they came up with this policy called value-based intermediation. Okay, it took 35 years for them to do this, to finally realize that changes are needed. So can we say that Islam played a big role? I may still say no. I may still say no. Yeah. Although I will admit that we've had policies, but has there been an impact? I'm not too sure. Because from all the reading and all the literature that has been written, it still looks as if we are referring to the conventional banking system, to the conventional economic system for our references. We are not developing from our own, let's say, sources of knowledge. Okay. Now, does it mean that we have failed? No. We have done pretty well. I think as a country, we have done pretty well, especially we are a country that is multi-ethnic, multi-religious, yeah, multicultural. It's not easy to talk about Islam and to make Islam part of your national policy in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country. But we've been able to do it. Okay, so a lot of discussion, but not much from Islamic perspective. I don't blame the government. I actually blame Dr. Nizam. Yeah? No, we blame ourselves. Yeah? As Islamic economies, we have not done enough. We have not done enough to develop the theory and then the policies from that theory. Yeah, we've not done enough. So I think we need to always look at ourselves. I think shortcoming of Islamic economies in coming up with those models, lack of support from government, maybe it's a sensitive issue. We once had somebody very high up in the Ministry of Finance coming to give us a talk in the department. And he said that it's very difficult to talk about Islam in economic planning because it's very sensitive. You're talking about multi-ethnic, multi-religious countries. It's very difficult. So what do we do in Malaysia? We look for universal values, right? We try to talk about universal. We talk about justice. We talk about it. Now, that's fine. I think that's a credible way of doing it, except that we need to connect it to our sources of knowledge. We need to have our own frameworks. And that is not going to be done by the government. That's going to be done by academics and researchers. Frameworks and benchmarks must be universal for internal use as well as global comparison. So we must be able to develop the frameworks and benchmark in such a way we can measure Islamic banks and also measure conventional banks. But now the measurement must be from Islamic point of view, not from the conventional part of it. Yeah, so this is the challenge that we face. Okay, just 5 minutes. Now this is just to show that we've done many other things. You can read up on your own. I just want to very quickly, 1 minute each. After Dr. Mahathir retired the first time, but he didn't retire, he came back again. So when he retired the first time, Abdullah Ahmad Badawi became the Prime Minister, and he introduced what is called Islam Hadari. Now, what is this Islam Hadari? Basically, it's you have to put it in context. 2003, this was after 9/11. This was after 2001, September 11th, when the Twin Towers crashed, and so Islam became a major problem. To mention the word Islam would have been a problem. So what did we do in Malaysia? We talked about Islam Hadari, and we tried to explain that this Islam Hadari was actually a progressive and civilizational form of Islam. Unfortunately for Abdullah Badawi, the timing was wrong, and at that time the government was not getting the support from majority of Muslim scholars and so on, and they didn't have people to explain, and the political will was lacking. I can put it that way, right? We need political will, we need people, we need policies. So you got the policy, but you don't have the political will and you don't have the people. Okay, the people went opposition at that time. But what did they do? They re-established the Islamic consultative, but now they say council, majlis, even higher. And Jakim was established. Now some may say good, some may say not so good, yeah. But from one Pusat Islam, you now make it a whole Jabatan Kemajuan Agama Islam as part of the Prime Minister's department. So you have upgraded the implementation. Now look at Islam Hadari. It's much wider than penerapan nilai-nilai Islam. So as a policy, it is much more comprehensive. But despite having a comprehensive policy, they didn't have the political will, they didn't have the people. All right, so more time we may talk about it. Let's go on. So then, of course, during the time of Najib Razak, there was no specific Islamic policy. I think all of us, I'm sure you also would have come across Satu Malaysia, right? That was the main policy initiative of the Prime Minister Najib at that time. And we just assume that Islam Hadari and Wasatiyah continues. Right? It continues. It's still there. You still got people talking about Wasatiyah at least. Maybe Islam Hadari is not discussed so much, but certainly Wasatiyah is still going on, adopting a moderate, balanced, just understanding of Islam. All right. Despite talking about Wasatiyah, and this is an interesting thing, there is a new breed of more conservative, exclusivist Islamic scholars that went into Jakib. Very conservative group of scholars, despite saying you want a more open. And this is what you see today now in the religious organizations. You have people who, some people consider them to be very conservative in their outlook. And this is going to be probably a challenge as we move forward for Islamic reforms. Then Dr. Mahathir came back. Again, you know, the Islam that he brought in, probably going back to his penerapan nilai-nilai Islam, he brought back look east as well. Okay. And what did we have? Something called Rahmatan lil Alamin. Islam meant for everyone. So that was the policy. Unfortunately, it was 22 months, so we don't have much time to analyze what they did. But interesting idea. In Malaysia, you talk about Islam as Rahmatan lil Alamin, Islam for all. It's an interesting idea, but again, 22 months. And then we had Perikatan National Government coming in. They talked about Manhaj Rabbani. Right? Again, we don't know much about what this Manhaj Rabbani is because they lasted for 17 months. So 22 months, 17 months, not much we can analyze. And then of course, during that time, they also emphasized a lot on the halal industries, and IBF became very, very important. Conservatism. Are we moving back to conservatism in Malaysia? And if we are, how is that going to impact economic policy? Yeah, this I think is a very important point. And then we had Perikatan Nasional 2.0 under UMNO. This one, how many months is that? 11 months. So again, very difficult to analyze. Maintain status quo, no new Islamic policies. What we know is there are many more cabinet positions. Yeah, so that, Keluarga Malaysia. So maybe that is what he will be known for. Continuation of ethnic and religious policies, albeit rising conservatism. And then finally, we have now, after GE15, we have a government for 40 days. 40 days already. Okay, maybe 45, coming up to 2 months. Yeah, we don't know how long it will last. Very lot of uncertainties, but we do have a document that was launched recently called Madani Vision for Malaysia. Right, for any of you who have read some of the works of Anwar Ibrahim, he wrote or he talked about Masyarakat Madani in the 1990s. And so now in this latest publication, he's talking about the Madani Vision for Malaysia. I suppose it will need greater analysis because it's still very, very new. We don't know what is meant by this. Okay, so as a whole, before we open for a few minutes of Q&A, I think what I've tried to argue is that Malaysia has been one of the Muslim countries that has been, I would say, brave enough to talk about religion in public policy. Okay, in that sense, Malaysia has gone against that modernization thesis. So we want our economic progress, we want to have material wealth, but we also want our religion. And so we have, since the 1980s, clear Islamic reforms that have tried to introduce Islamic perspectives in how you develop. All right. In order to do that, it needs political will, it needs people, and it needs policies, as well as a supporting environment. Various administrations have introduced their views of Islamic reforms. Some of them lack one or the other. All right. They may have policies, but they don't have political will. Some may have political will, they didn't have the policies, right? And so on. So in order to be successful, you need all of these factors. All right. Now, this framework, I think, can be utilized, as I said, in any country. So if you're from Pakistan, you're from the Sudan, you're from any African country, you could ask the question, do we have political will? Do we have the people? Do we have the policies? And do we have the supporting environment? So you could analyze your countries in that sense. Okay. All right. So with that, I stop here. I think the slides have been given to Dr. Nizam. You can take a read, and then I look forward to some Q&A from all of you.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Aslam, for the very interesting presentation. I believe everyone has been enlightened about the potential role. So you may say no, others may say yes. Yeah? So it is safer for us to say the potential role of Islam in its contribution to economic development in Malaysia. So we have around 10 minutes left before 5. So let us have a quick Q&A session. So anyone wants to ask questions or give comments?
No.
Yeah, introduce yourself.
Yeah, Assalamualaikum. My name is Amar.
Yeah, continue.
Okay, I just want to ask because I'm from economics department, so basically I always wonder what actually is Islamic economics, because somehow when I'm going through the syllabus and stuff, we just learn more in terms of as I think Professor mentions about banking, finance, we learn about the contracts and stuff, but it's very rare for us to learn about like on how Islamic economics view on the, for example, supply and demand side, on about GDP output, income, etc. So what actually is Islamic economy? Is it some things I mean, like the way we run economics that are the stipulated under Sharia guidelines, or is something else? So that's the thing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brother Ahmad. Can we have 2 more for this first round?
Yes, Jazakallah khair for the presentation.
Yes, introduce yourself first. Yeah. Yes.
Ryan, I wanted to ask about the BBI. What initiatives has Bank Negara Malaysia taken to promote the development of value-based intermediation in Islamic finance industry in Malaysia? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. One more?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead. Introduce yourself and quickly ask the question.
My name is Shahmi. Okay. So in the slide just now, I see that halal is one of the Islamic influences in Malaysia policy. So I want to know, is there any policy to make Malaysia the global halal standard?
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I start with Shami. I think firstly, you should read this annual report that comes out, the Global Islamic Economy Report. It comes out every year or every other year from an organization in Dubai. Okay? And they try to measure the development of the halal industry in all Muslim countries, right? And I think right from the beginning, it must be now, I don't know, 7, 8 years that they're coming up with this report. Malaysia has always come number 1. And the reason is because they divide it into 7 or 8 or 9 sectors. Islamic banking or Islamic finance is a big part of it. And because Malaysia is quite advanced in banking finance, so we always get, big marks there. And then there's, pharmaceuticals, fashion, tourism, etc. So we've been coming out number 1. Now, whether or not Malaysia can be the, what you say, global, what? Okay, that one is a bit tricky because that will depend on your fiqh opinions, right? And it may not be that simple for Malaysia to become the reference point of all other countries in the world. I mean, I give you an example. In Islamic banking, we used to have certain views which were not acceptable in other parts of the Muslim world. And rather than they follow us, we followed them. So now we don't talk about Bayalaina anymore in Malaysia. We have also joined the international community, and gone for tawarruk. Not to say that that's any much better than what we had previously, but in order to be the global benchmark, I think it's not the same as to say that we are leaders in Islamic banking or the leaders in the tourism and so on. That can be done by other variables, but to become the sole, the leader of the standards, that requires more than just having good opinions. There's a lot of politics also involved. I think in the OIC you can see it as well. Sometimes there are certain countries that are very powerful, even though their views may not be really progressive, but their views dominate, right? So your question requires political analysis. It's not so easy. VBI, 2017 October, I think they came up with the document. Well, some banks have taken it upon themselves to champion this VBI. I think Maybank, maybe Dr. Nizam can add on this. Maybank is a main player in trying to materialize this. It's interesting that VBI is only for Islamic banks. It's not for conventional banks. That's going to be quite a tough thing. You set VBI as an Islamic banking target, but not for conventional banks. I'm not sure conventional banks, maybe just ESG. Conventional banks do the ESG thing, but for Islamic banks, they talk about value-based intermediation. So some banks are trying to do this, and I believe Bank Negara is, after the 2-year COVID thing, they have restarted efforts. I was told just 2 days ago that they have some meetings from the various committees trying to see how they are going to manifest this CBI moving forward. But it's been very slow. And some critics actually say that VBI is not really something very, very great. It's been done for years already under the ESG and under there's another thing that we talk, ethical banking, right? Ethical banking has been going on for decades already. And then you have this ESG. So VBI, some people say that we are too late. I suppose better late than never. So whether we can translate that into something concrete, this would be interesting. And finally, the question about what is actually this one is a tough question. That's why I came to this slide. You look at the Islamic Consultative Board. What was their purpose? Everything the government does, policies, you make sure it is in line with Islam. So can you imagine, not only banking, you want to talk about industrial policy, you want to talk about tourism, you want to talk about service sector. Everything must have an Islamic perspective, and it must be in line with that perspective. Okay? Now, so that's why I'm saying we have not done our work. Economists and maybe even sociologists, political scientists, we've not done. The only people who have done the work are the Sharia advisors and the bankers. So they run the banking industry. So they have done a lot. And that is why Islamic banking becomes a kind of a reference point, and even other countries want to have it. Because they've done work. We may disagree with the direction and what they've done, but they've done something. I don't think we've done enough to talk about what should be, for example, Malaysia, 12 Malaysia plan. Okay? How much work did we do to give inputs for Malaysia's 12 Malaysia plan from Islamic perspective? Or even the shared prosperity vision. Okay? We should be looking at the document and giving analysis from Islamic perspective. It requires people to get together and critically evaluate and so on. So we have to do this, or else we will end up continuing to look at banking and finance.
Thank you very much, Prof. Aslam. Maybe in these few minutes, we can have a second round. Yeah. Ladies first.
Maybe you can.
Yeah, sisters. Yeah. Can we have sisters? Huh? No sisters? Okay.
So can I ask?
Yeah, sure.
It's very rare, you know. I'm surprised. Brothers of Allah.
Assalamualaikum, sir.
Waalaikumsalam.
My
Yes.
name is Dini Aiman. Over here. You mentioned earlier regarding that there's a lot of international agencies like the IMF telling us what to do. Even they have come up with, the Western style on how we achieving the developed countries, right? So, but in our perspective, of course, as an Islamic country, we do have to against the secularism on how they achieve that kind of developed country. So my question is, are there any examples of kind of really successful applications of Islamic economics in the real world today, so that we as Malaysia, particularly, to be emulated in our system? And if that's not, what is your opinion regarding this kind of matter?
Thank you. Can
Okay.
we have
All right.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Muhammad Kamal Hassani. Okay, so you mentioned about Al-Arqam. So back in 1977, Al-Arqam, a religious organization, got involved in the economy, especially in the field of manufacturing and food. We know that Al-Arqam has been banned and declared as a site or heretical. And we know that the Prime Minister at that time, Dr. Mahathir, didn't like the founder of Al-Arqam, Sharif Muhammad, for some reason. But its economic activities continue to run, and surprisingly, they have more than 500 domestic and foreign business networks. But now maybe 700 plus. So my question is, to what extent did Al-Arqam's economic activities impact the Islamic economy in Malaysia at that time? Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The last question.
Okay, sure.
And my name is Abdul Hamid.
Yes, brother.
For a country to be considered as developed, it needs to grow this economy, and to do that, it needs to have a large population base that spends money excessively. In other words, it needs extravagancy or consumerism culture, because that's what drives the economy. To spend every last penny of yours. In other words, to be led by your desires instead of restraining them. So, can we say that in today's world, for a Muslim country to be considered as quote unquote developed or modernized, it needs to forego or abandon their Islamic values. That's it.
Sure, no question from sisters at all.
Last chance for you. Go on. Anyone?
Okay.
No.
We have one.
Okay,
One
okay.
from your class. Okay. Okay, so let me try to
Able to remember.
if I don't, then I'll ask you. So let's start with the last one first. I think when we talk about all these terms that are used, there is, of course, a kind of a political dimension to it, because you want people to gather around a certain kind of goal. So you give names to it. I mean, one of the criticisms of Islam Havari was actually, why do we need another Islam? Isn't Islam good enough, right? And so they didn't like the additional word. But I think you have to understand the policy at that time, because to just talk about Islam would have been very difficult, looking at the global scenario. And so you needed, kind of a catchphrase. I'm assuming the same thing in Pakistan. It's coming at a certain time. But at the end of the day, it's exactly what was asked earlier. We just need to look at everything from an Islamic lens. whether you use the term Islam or not, that really is a secondary thing, right? As long as it represents Islam. But you want to make it known that you are referring to Islam. That could be political reason, or it could be just, people want it like that. They would prefer to have a reference to Islam. Did other countries look at Malaysia and learn experience? Well, at one time in the mid-90s, I remember Malaysia was going around all over the African world and even Asian world and, presenting what they did and so on. So whether or not any countries took examples, I cannot say for sure. But I do know that, for example, our new economic policy was utilized partially in South Africa because they saw what we had done for the Putra community. So in South Africa, they wanted to think of a policy. I don't know whether they adopted our policy wholesale or it's very impossible. It's not possible to import wholesale. You will have to make some modifications. Okay, so that's one. Now we have Arkam. Arkam did have a good, you can say, merchant economy. Maybe a small scale when it first started in the 70s and later on in the 80s. All the Nashid groups ultimately will go back to Arkam. There used to be very popular Nashid groups. Your toothpaste, I can't remember the name, but it used to be one of the earliest was toothpaste coming from Arkam. And then mee noodles, the and kicha. So they used to do these small things. And later on, they went international. Today, I think they are called what? Global Ikhwan, is it? Yeah, and then there's another name. So they have actually expanded overseas as well. But whether or not that model can be replicated, firstly, whether it contributed to the Malaysian economy, I don't think at that point in time it was a very big contribution to Malaysian economy. Because what was big was their international ventures. And I don't think that money came back to Malaysia. So it was outside. Whether or not Arkam can be a model to be emulated, I think the problem was with their issues relating to Aqidah. Yeah, and why were they banned? I mean, from the information that I remember, they had been around for a long time, and they were talking about all their beliefs and whatever, a long time, easily 2 decades. The government didn't take action until I was told that the leader got a dream in which he's supposed to be the leader for Malaysia. So then automatically so maybe groups that have this kind of arrangement where it's a very much closed community, it always ends up with the leader having some dream. And when they have dreams, it always ends up badly for them. Yeah? So if there's any reason why we cannot or we should not necessarily make Arkam, I think it's more the Aqidah issue. But as a model, we have Prof. Shukri Saleh from USM, who did his PhD on Arkam. So if you're interested, you should read the model. Very interesting model, actually. Grassroots model, right? But how to make it bigger scale, that may be a tough thing, because they were still very, very small scale in Malaysia.
From Brother Abdul Hamid on consumerism.
Consumerism, and Kimi was?
On, what was your question?
The first question was what?
My first question is there any examples of successful application?
Well, if you look at various studies that have looked at successful countries, Malaysia comes up usually number 1 or 2 among Muslim countries. So whatever we've been doing, generally speaking, I think we do relatively well. There are some countries which apparently have done well, but because of all the sanctions on them, like Iran and Sudan, you find that they usually are not in those numbers. Yeah? But in terms of Iran and Sudan, apparently in terms of their banking finance, it's quite different. They've done quite well, etc. But politically, they have been marginalized with all the sanctions. I mean, if you think about it, in the case of Iran, right from the time the revolution happened, they've been involved in one war after another, and most of the time coming from outside. So they've not had time to benefit from, their people don't leave them alone, basically. Yeah? So they have lots of challenges. Same thing in the Sudan. There have been some non-Muslim countries with good Muslim minorities doing quite good work. I mean, I would go to America and you look at the Muslim community in America, they've been quite active. Same thing maybe in Britain, you can find good examples, but at the national level, they're not going to do anything because it's not a Muslim country. For Muslim countries, I'm not sure what are the latest countries, maybe I suppose Saudi Arabia is making a big, I was just reading, just somebody got a video about the agriculture revolution in Saudi Arabia. Apparently they've now got a huge amount of agriculture. They are exporting wheat, farm produce, blah, blah, blah. So I think quite an impressive thing. You think about Saudi Arabia, you think only desert. So they've done pretty well there. But I don't know whether there can be examples that Turkey, of course, was another very good example. But in the last few years, they've been having lots of challenges as well, right? With high inflation and so on. It would seem as if anytime a country wants to talk about themselves and talk about Islam, then they get hit. So Indonesia, right? In fact, I can even tell you, 97, 98 crisis. I was in the US in 96, and I went to visit Said Hussein Nasser. So this was in 96 October. And I remember I went there, we were feeling very proud because from Malaysia, we are well known, people look up to Malaysia. And then he told me, I worry when you become very famous. When you become famous, I worry because people will start looking at you. Okay? And at that time, I didn't take him seriously. I think we can do it because we've done so well, etc. Then in 1997, when Indonesia also started talking about Islamic reforms, maybe even more people start to worry. Malaysia, 30 million. Nobody's interested. Small country. 300 million. Indonesia wants to also talk about Islam. Then people start to. So did the 1998 crisis, was it connected to people trying to, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I got no time to think about conspiracies. As somebody told us in this very hall, because one of our lecturers said, all these things is conspiracy against Islam. And then this person from IMF, he was a former IMF director, he said, don't waste your time thinking about other people. Just focus on your own country, do your best. There will always be people wanting to bring you down. But you cannot be thinking all the time only about people wanting to bring you down. You have to do something to make yourself a success. And in the same time, you will then be able to answer. So that is maybe my answer to you. Finally, about consumerism, and you have to have big population and be extravagant, I don't think so. America is not probably the best example. I think in all surveys about the best countries to live, America is never there on the top. All the Scandinavian countries, they don't have big populations. They don't spend, tremendously a lot. But their countries are apparently good places to live. Right? Various indicators, they come up tops. New Zealand, right? And so I don't think you need to have big spending and spending on and become consumerist. Culture should not necessarily be there. It's how you want to develop your country. The issue is, will people leave you alone? I think that's the problem. Sometimes you cannot. So we have this discussion in our PhD class. You want to change the rules, but people don't allow you to change the rules. You don't want to play the game. They don't allow you not to play the game. You have to play the game. Right? So you say you don't want to play American football. I want to start another game, sepak takraw. Right? They don't allow you to do that. You have to play American football. And then nobody wants to play sepak takraw. So your fellow Muslims don't want to play sepak takraw. They want to play football. And because this time Tunisia entered the semi-final, everybody wants to become Tunisia. Sorry, not Tunisia. Morocco. Right? So can you put a different model that is based on your tradition and your values, and people will be happy to see you succeed? It's quite tough. So we need to be very strategic how we go about presenting our Islamic agenda. Okay, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Prof. Aslam, for responding to all of the questions. Yeah. Alhamdulillah, not only we are getting a lecture on Islam and economic development, but also some of the, other ideas on related aspects of economic development. So we are running over some 15 minutes, so I quickly wrap up the session. I thank you all for joining the session, and especially I thank Prof. Aslam for his willingness to share his views and also thoughts on this issue. Let us give a show of our appreciation to Prof. Aslam. So I would like to close the session with the recitation of Surah Al-As. Okay, so we have refreshment downstairs at CIE meeting room. So I invite those people who have participated in the Q&A, those who have asked questions, answered questions, give comments. So you are rewarded by having you are invited as our guest. You can also have more interaction with Prof. Aslam later. Yeah? And also our academic staff, you are invited as well. Yeah. Okay, so sure. These are all, I mean, those who are participating.